Currently, Howard Sub can be fed through 3 lines: the Howard Fremont, Howard Shoal, or Howard Ross 134.5 lines. These lines are then connected to either Bank 1 or Bank 2 through the operating bus in the rack. The bank transformers then step the 34.5 kV down to 4 kV and feed the north and south tunnels going inside of the blockhouse. Here's a look inside one of the tunnels. Facing this way is the outdoor switch rack where we just came from, and facing the other way is the indoor regulator room where we'll be doing most of our switching. The north and south tunnels then connect to either 4 kV bus 1 or bus 2. Having 2 options is what gives us redundancy to pick between the two. To connect a feeder to one of these buses, we're going to close the appropriate disconnect for that bus, checking first the label 4 kV, disconnect D, the feeder number, in this case 1, and then bus 1 or bus 2. Before we close any disconnect, we're always going to make sure that the breaker is open. This way we don't pick up the feeder's load through a disconnect. We're also going to verify that the opposite bus disconnect is in the open position. Next, we're going to want to make sure the regulator disconnect is closed by checking the label again: 4 kV, D, disconnect, the feeder number, then R, regulator. If this disconnect wasn't closed, we would close it manually. But again, before we close any disconnect, we want to make sure that the appropriate breaker is open. Now, if we were going to close the breaker, 4 kV would flow from the bus through the closed disconnect, through an amp meter, into a reactor downstairs, which is just used to limit large current changes. From the reactor, current would flow through the breaker and into the regulator. We can use the regulator to step up or step down the feeder voltage by changing the turns ratio of the regulator. From here, current flows through the regulator disconnect and out to the getaway into the field. It's kind of hard to visualize, so I'm going to draw it here on the one line so you could follow. And that's the basic current path of a feeder in Howard. However, most of the switching at Howard involves isolating either a regulator or breaker, and to do this, we're going to have to use the transfer bus to avoid dropping load. The secret to using the transfer bus is feeder 18. Feeder 18's getaway has been isolated, so the only purpose of feeder 18 is to feed the transfer bus and any other connected load. To start this procedure, we first make sure that the transfer bus is clear. We get current on the feeder that we're trying to isolate. This is going to be our actual load, and we'll reference it later. Next, we're going to close feeder 18 to the same bus as the feeder to be isolated. As always, checking that the breaker is open and the opposite bus disconnect is in the open position.
18 feeder disconnects to bus number 2, 4D18B2. Okay, this is 4D18B2. Breaker's open. Breaker's open. 4D18B2, come close. Come and close. Okay, all three show.
Next, we have to close the DC switch so that the breaker's closing coil can operate.
To step number 6, we're going to close the DC switch on number 18 feeder CB.
After that, we can close the transfer and regulator disconnects for feeder 18. If you notice, we call it the position of the disconnect. Because they're so close to each other, it's easy to mix them up. Always know what disconnect you're operating and double check to make sure you're operating the right one.
4D18T. 4D18T. Okay, 4D18T. Is this top right set? Top right set. Okay, 4D18T. Come and close. Come and close. All three are closed. All three are closed.
And when we close the breaker, the bus will heat up the feeder 18 regulator, which will then energize the transfer bus. Before we parallel the two feeders, we need to match the voltage. We do this by setting feeder 18's voltage to full lower and matching the other feeder's voltage. Sometimes due to a difference in regulators and windings, we might not go to completely full lower, but we typically like to be around 117 volts, but this may vary and so we might have to adjust it while we're switching. Now that the voltage is the same, we can parallel by closing the feeder's transfer disconnect. You only get one shot, and don't open this disconnect after closing or else you'll be breaking parallel. With the two feeders in parallel, we now need to calculate our circulating current. This is caused by differences in windings and can lead to a large current flow if uncontrolled. We do this by getting a new amp reading on both feeders and we add them together using the highest phase from our original reading. Then we subtract our actual load and divide by 2. This is our circulating current, and as long as it's under 100, it's okay. If it wasn't, we can adjust the regulators to try to limit the circulating current. Once the circulating current is at an acceptable range, we can break parallel by opening up that feeder's regulator disconnect. Next, we're going to get a final current reading to ensure proper load transfer, and if it checks out, then we can open the breaker, open the DC switch, and then open up the bus disconnect to isolate that feeder. To clarify, that getaway's feeder will still be energized and we won't have lost load. The transfer bus will be fed by feeder 18, but the equipment between the two disconnects will be isolated. From here, we can apply our tags, and then we'll get a clearance or an OK2 to work on the equipment that we need to replace or fix. And that just about covers a basic switching procedure here at Howard.